Hello and welcome to Balance the World with Dave Dettman. Today's guest is my little brother, Sean Dettman. Welcome back, buddy.
Thanks for having me, Dave. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, man. Thanks for being on the show. Quick reminder, Sean is the director of Jersey International Center for Advanced Studies, or JICAS for short, where it is a postgraduate and research center with a focus on islands and island communities, right?
That is correct. And I just
Uh,
want to say it's old Jersey, not New Jersey. Jersey in the UK, the island nation of Jersey, not New Jersey. That's for sure.
Hey, thank you for making that clear. Yeah.
A distinction that's worth making.
Yes, it is. It's the little island right off of France, right? About 12 miles off of France.
That's right. It's part of the Channel Islands, which, again, for an American audience is confusing because, of course, there's the Channel Islands off the coast of California, too.
Right,
So
right.
it's Jersey, New Jersey, Channel Islands, Channel Islands. So
Yeah,
there's a lot of synergies, a lot of similarities between the two.
right. How close is it to Normandy?
Yes, so we are approximately 12 miles off of the Norman coast. So although it is part of the British Isles,
Mm-hmm.
geographically it's much closer to
Yeah,
France, and it
way
has always
closer.
been kind of a hot spot of kind of you know British Franco relations or
Now
lack of
imagine.
relations.
Now
Yeah,
imagine they fought over that island a few times.
1,000 years.
Yeah. And how far south is it to like where the Normandy invasion was? A lot of
Yeah,
people
so
relate that to, you know.
absolutely, absolutely. So it is 1,000 years from the birth of William the Conqueror in 2027.
Hmm.
So there's a big kind of celebration for the millennium of his birth, and Jersey played a really important part actually with the Norman conquest
Hmm.
into southeast England, and of course the Battle of Hastings in 1066. So
Okay.
it's always been at the forefront of those kind of relationships between the kingdoms that
Mm-hmm.
went back and forth across the medieval and even in early to the modern period. There's fortifications that
Mm-hmm.
were erected during the Napoleonic Wars. So we're talking
Sure.
about early 19th century.
Lots of castles and stuff still there.
They
Yeah, I
call it
saw.
Fortress Island.
Man, I tell you, I saw a map of all the. It had a red dot for where all the castles are in Europe, and man, that's all it was back in those days. The
Yep,
Dark Ages was nothing but medieval castles and
yep. It's
protect.
amazing. There's amazing catalog
Mm.
of fortifications and castles on Jersey, considering it's a 9 by 5 island with 100,000 people. I mean,
Yeah,
that's today's standard.
it's like
You can
all
imagine
nothing but castles.
it is, yeah, exactly, exactly. Few peasant farmers and garrisons everywhere.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, anyway, today we are going to talk about your paper, your publication paper that you wrote about the Sterling, Illinois Barbwire Company, which is close to Rockford, where I live and where you grew up. So, be interesting to talk about that as well as the fight that the employees had to unionize. Because from what I understand, I'm gonna have you talk about it here in a second, but it was one of the first fights, union fights in the country. So it's a pretty big deal. And then I want to get into the importance of labor unions in the workforce, and also where I'd like to lead that into, or maybe finish up with, why American workers are so angry today. The fight between labor and capital and owners is been going on forever, and it's apparent today just as much. And then maybe finish up a little more socialism versus capitalism debate. Where the right balance between the two is always the best. So, and as always, the main focus of this podcast is to help the human race figure out how it can establish a balance with our planet. So, with that being said, let's get into it. If you would, please introduce your paper and your research and why you wrote it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the paper is called Victory at
Mm.
Northwestern Barbwire Company. The CEO, Communism, and the Battle to Organize the Steel Industry, comma, July 1936. And you and I know this company quite well.
Mm-hmm.
We know the actual steel mill extremely well.
Yep.
So both of our parents grew up in Sterling, Illinois,
Mm-hmm.
and our grandfather was a foreman at Northwestern. It changed names, but at the time of this, it was called the Northwestern Barbwire Company. It comes Northwestern Steel Wire Company.
Mm-hmm.
But we grew up looking at this, kind of this very, very kind of looming kind of structure in the back of Grandpa's yard. You look at it and it's kind of omnipresent in the
Mm-hmm.
community of Sterling and Rock Falls, isn't it?
Yeah.
Everybody has a connection to the steel mill.
Right.
And either you work at it, one of your family members work at it, or it is underpins a lot of the discussions,
Mm-hmm.
both at a kind of a socioeconomic but also socio-political level.
Right.
And so it's always just been in the background of our trips down to Sterling, of which we were there all the time growing up.
Right.
And it just has always it's always loomed large in my understanding of the way the world works from a very
Mm-hmm.
early age.
Mm-hmm.
It's informed my thinking in terms of what labor versus capital means.
Mm-hmm.
And it also is a way to relate the rest of the world in many ways, having kind of had this visceral feeling around the steel
Mm-hmm.
mill, this real kind of inherent, inbuilt kind of understanding of the world as seen through the lens of this steel mill.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's not uncommon for a lot of Americans to kind of have those formative experiences early in their life around the socioeconomic or the socio-political dialogues and conversations that are happening around them.
Right.
When we're 10 and 12 years old, we just go down there for Thanksgiving and for Christmas, and it's about
Mm-hmm.
the turkey and the presents, or the fireplace in the big living room, that was the house that was adjacent to the actual steel mill.
Yeah. Loud
But
trains going by every half hour.
yeah, the shunting back and forth,
Mm-hmm.
from that massive space. I mean, the
Mm-hmm.
steel mill was huge.
It's a
It
big
spanned the
facility.
entire,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a massive facility.
Yeah.
And so I think that, as I was writing this paper and as I was undertaking the research, I didn't really realize how much the conversations that were going on at that time in our lives actually have informed my thinking now.
Right.
Again, to that kind of, gut position. And I don't think that that's uncommon for a lot of Americans, particularly people of our generation that grew up on the lower end of the socioeconomic scale, but have subsequently, assumed a position of decision making and kind of climbed that, socioeconomic upward mobility ladder. So,
Mm-hmm.
it's that kind of that position in my own mind. So that was really kind of the motivation for looking at the steel mill, and
Mm-hmm.
it really was almost started off kind of like a genealogy project,
Right.
even I would say, because as you said before, the the organization I work for focuses on islands and island communities, and myself, um, I look at how the New Deal was exported across the
Mm-hmm.
globe right before the Second World War, but then also, of course, immediately following
Mm-hmm.
the Second World War,
And
and
this was
and how
36, so this was right in the middle of the Great Depression, huh?
it's smack dab in the middle of it. It's
Yeah.
smack dab in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
So the New Deal is a very important part of my own research and my own research agenda, and then of course the implementation of things like Social Security in places like Jersey where I live, which
Mm-hmm.
was a really big deal. So it cross maps against some of the stuff that I work on a day to day basis. But as you said, this particular episode
Mm-hmm.
within the steel mill's history, but within the broader strokes of the organization of the steel industry
Mm-hmm.
is a really interesting aspect of all of this. So
Right.
as I was kind of just perusing through the material, looking at some of the stuff that is online, which is not a lot because there is no archive. The steel
Mm-hmm.
mill no longer exists. There's still some of the furnaces that are open today and still fire, but the Northwestern Steel Mill company no longer exists.
Hmm.
It's been bought off and sold away piece by
Right.
piece.
Right.
So there wasn't a lot of information. There wasn't a lot of information about it. But what there is available, right, and what I was able to access,
Hmm.
kind of led me down this path to this particular episode.
Well,
And
and let me ask you real quick. Why is it that you chose to write it? Because it has nothing to do with your PhD, right? This is just kind of a side publication project.
yeah, exactly. It's not really. It lives on the periphery of my day to day research,
Okay.
but it does cross map against these big themes. If you
Mm-hmm.
look at the New Deal, and you look at democracy promotion, and both before and immediately following the Second World War,
Mm-hmm.
this is not a natural fit. But as we start to discuss kind of the ins and outs of the actual processes that unfold across the summer of 1936 and the events that unfold across summer of 1936 and the cast of characters that
Mm-hmm.
are involved in these events, you
Mm-hmm.
start to see, well, there's a connection here and there's a
Mm-hmm.
connection there, and there's obviously similar situations happening in Pennsylvania, and there's also situations
Mm-hmm.
happening in Alabama and
Right.
Washington State, and
Right.
so you start to build this bigger picture. The mosaic becomes a little
Mm-hmm.
bit fuller and a little bit brighter. And
Right.
so you think that, well, yeah, okay, this kind of lives in my everyday research.
So it's something you've just been piecing together for a while now. It's not something you had to get done by a certain time. You can just kind of work on it as you go and as you research
Yeah,
more and find out more information.
exactly. I mean,
Okay.
for all intents and purposes, it was a hobby piece
Okay.
that turned into a nice little publication,
Yeah, it's a good
and
one.
something I really enjoyed.
Yeah, and as I was reading it, there's a lot of things in there I'm hoping you're going to get to here in a second, and I'll ask you about. But like you said, some of the players in it, we're talking the Kremlin. I thought that was pretty
Yep.
cool. So
Yeah,
and like you said,
absolutely.
that this has to do with might be one of the first cases or one of the bigger ones, but it happens all the time, and that's why I'm so interested in it. So,
Yeah, exactly. It's connecting it to the everyday American.
mm-hmm,
And
absolutely,
that's the stock, if you will,
mm-hmm,
that we come from. We're
mm-hmm,
the everyday Americans.
the working class.
um the working classes. I mean, we weren't by any means poor. We weren't
Mm-hmm,
hungry poor. But
mm-hmm.
we didn't. We lived in the everyday zone.
That's right.
And again, your class behaviors are formative experiences, are literally,
Mm-hmm,
they're formed
mm-hmm.
by your early years. Those
Yeah.
formative experiences are really
Yeah, for
mapped
watching
against your
how
class.
watching how hard dad worked all those years, that that forms your opinion on these things quite a bit.
Yeah, exactly. Your work
Mhm.
ethic,
Mhm.
your understanding of what it means to contribute to your community. Yeah, what it means to leverage your labor for a bigger
Mhm.
slice of the pie.
Mhm.
So all of these things kind of sit in the periphery of my day to day. But like you said, most of my research focuses on democracy promotion and its relationship with power. And we can
Mhm.
kind of circle back to that if you want. But
Sure.
so the crux of the paper
Mhm.
is that there was a schism in the American labor movement in the mid 1930s,
Mhm.
and it could have been triggered by the onset of the New Deal.
Mhm.
It could have been triggered by the passing of the Wagner Act in
Mhm.
1936, which strengthened the right to collective bargaining,
Mhm.
and strengthened the labor position from a legislative point of view. It was a law that passed through Congress,
Mhm.
which made it the law of the land at a federal level.
Mhm.
So I think that's important to talk about. But really, what it comes down to is that the American Federation of Labor,
Mhm.
or the AFL, had been around from a long time, since the 1880s. But they were their main focus, and who they catered to, what we call craft industries, and we have horizontal labor unions. And so, if you can just hold those key terms in your mind, I'll explain exactly what they are. So,
Mhm.
craft labor unions represent workers that are skilled or highly skilled laborers.
Okay.
So think about electricians, right?
Mm-hmm.
Stonemasons,
Mm-hmm.
right? Artisan type craft positions,
The
jobs.
engineers. Yeah.
So if you think about an electrician cuts across a number of different industries, don't they?
Mm-hmm.
They're not. It's not. There's not an industry of electricians. It's a
Mm-hmm.
profession, right?
That's right.
It's a craft labor position, right? It's highly skilled, and you could even say that it's artisan. So the AFL largely focused on these craft labor positions, these different types of jobs that were more associated with these horizontal labor structures. So they would cut across different industries.
Mm-hmm.
And more importantly, they were skilled labor force. And that was great. And they acted as a, as a catalyzing force for these people to leverage their labor for a more significant piece of the pie, greater decision making, and they were able to withdraw their labor if they were not being treated well. That's great.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. Now, demographically, these were largely white males that had some education.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, as we know, whether by hook or by crook, and we could spend the whole podcast talking about this alone,
Right.
but that excluded a large population of the working classes,
Mm-hmm.
particularly blacks and women.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They were not allowed to join these craft unions because they tended, again, by hook or by crook, we could
Mm-hmm.
talk about this until the cows come home,
Sure.
but they were usually employed in unskilled positions.
Okay.
So if we hold on to those two terms, right, craft unions or craft industries that are represented in these horizontal unions, or synonymous with skilled labor or highly skilled labor.
Mm-hmm.
So that left out a large portion of the population,
Right.
a large portion of the population.
Yeah.
And these are kind of heavy industries: coal, steel,
Mm-hmm.
auto manufacturing,
Mm-hmm.
right? You have people coming into these industries that are highly skilled and, dare I say, artisan craft, right? Professionals to plug in the electronics. But the people who are the press operators, the factory workers, right? The unskilled labor, where did they turn to?
Right.
Right? More importantly, the blacks were largely excluded
Sure.
from the craft union model. That's
Sure.
not to say that the laborers themselves were opposed to integrating
Right.
blacks into their unions, but the AFL itself did very little to help that process.
Sure. Sure.
So, we don't want to speak in generalizations, but for the most part, that was the pattern, demographically and socioeconomically.
Right.
So you have this whole sector, this whole heavy industries, right, that are underrepresented at a union level. And there was one particular man who did a lot to turn that tide and to seek representation for the unskilled, right?
Mm-hmm. Fighting on their
Or
behalf.
exactly, right? Unskilled labor force, and to create and establish vertical unions.
Mm-hmm.
So it was no longer skilled labor force that cut across industries. They wanted to unionize the entire industry. So whether you were a secretary, whether you were an unskilled worker, or whether you were highly skilled, working the blast furnace or whatever it
Right.
was,
Right.
everybody in that industry
Mm-hmm.
was represented through one union.
Yeah. Good. That's the way it should be. Yeah.
So this really largely comes out of the coal industry,
Mm-hmm.
and the right immediately before and after the First World War, so in the
Mm-hmm.
1920s, and
Right.
then the coal industry starts to model this up and model this out into other heavy industries. So a
Mm-hmm.
man named John L. Lewis, in the early to mid 30s started to make some noises about creating these vertical union structures, right? These industrial union structures, and
Mm-hmm.
breaking away, right, from the AFL in an organization that he called the Committee for Industrial Organization, or the
Was he at
CIO.
was he at the company in Sterling or in Washington?
Yeah, no. So he works at a much higher level, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he works at a federal level, right?
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So the CIO is a federal, right? It is a
Mm-hmm.
nationwide organization aimed at implementing these vertical, right, industrial union structures.
Okay.
And so we no longer, the AFL has represented the craft and horizontal, and the CIO is now saying we need now to organize the industrial vertical structures.
Okay.
And so that's what they do. There's a major schism across the labor movement. The AFL threatened to throw the members, the 12 rebel unions, out of the AFL for what is amounts to insurrection charges.
Mm-hmm.
That they're this is unlawful. You're going against everything the unions stand for. You're tearing the American worker apart. You're trying to implement a lack of choices, and this is what
Mm-hmm.
labor movement's all about. And so we have that immediate schism between the AFL and the CIO.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and as you can tell, right, the CIO is the one that the Northwestern Barbed Wire Company is associated with.
Okay.
So we have that at a national level, right? We have that as a national level,
Mm-hmm.
and across 1935 and early 1936,
So basically, you're
these
saying the
unions.
storm is brewing, all over the country, even
Yep,
before it hits Sterling.
yep. Because remember, this is the high watermark of labor
Mm-hmm.
organization. You just had the
Right.
Wagner Act come in,
Yeah.
right, which emboldens and empowers you
Mm-hmm.
to undertake these processes and
Mm-hmm.
organize your labor into unions. And we're starting to see this triggers, of course, a series of strikes
Oh
and a
yeah.
series of organization,
Mm-hmm.
campaigns of organization across the country, and
Well, right in the
in a
middle of the
number
Great
of different
Depression,
industries.
everybody's desperate. Everybody's,
Absolutely.
I'm sure the emotions were running high all over the country and in Washington, and help. You know.
Yes. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. I mean, it slots right into Roosevelt's three R's, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is relief, recovery, and reform. Those are
Mm-hmm.
the three R's of the New Deal, and
Right.
this kind of hits the reform kind of, as well
Mm-hmm.
as touches on the other two.
Mm-hmm.
So you're absolutely right.
Mm-hmm.
These are meta narratives. These
Mm-hmm.
are big conversations happening
Mm-hmm.
across the country
Right.
and across a number of different industries.
So was it a specific spark that happened in Sterling, or did it just brew up over time, or was there a particular incident that sparked everything?
It's chronology, really.
Okay.
The luck of chronology.
Mm-hmm.
So by spring summer of 1936,
Mm-hmm.
right, we have the SWOC, right, which is the Steel Workers Organizing Committee, is established with money from the CIO. They give them $500,000 to create the Steel Workers Organizing Committee, and one of the major hubs of the SWOC was in Chicago.
Okay.
So again, we have geography and chronology kind of colliding
Sure.
here.
Sure.
And in early July of 1936, the workers at the Northwestern Barbed Wire Company went on strike over a dispute about pay.
Okay.
It's effectively they adjusted the tonnage on some of the different departments, and they
Mm-hmm.
weren't hitting their quotas, and management docked them accordingly.
Sure.
Of course, what the workers at um, Northwestern Barbed Wire Company were saying is, listen, you've put in these new furnaces, and we need some training. We need some time to adjust. We're not going to hit our quotas
Right.
because this is all new, and as a result, you're penalizing us.
Right.
for putting in these new furnaces and us not being able to adjust, and you're docking us in pay, and that's not fair.
Right. Okay.
So it was the bale wire department that actually were the first to walk out, and then a number of other departments followed suit. And by the 7th and 8th of July, we had approximately 250, 280 of the 900 workforce on strike,
Hmm.
and they
They
walked
didn't
out
all go out,
that
huh?
day.
Just
Not
only
not not
what's it?
not initially. Not initially.
Okay.
Yeah. So at the on the first day of the strike, we have these people, these right disgruntled workers, right, these maligned workforce that take to industrial action,
Hmm.
and then over the course of the next week, we have an additional sympathy strikers, or people who are also subsequently affected by the tonnage and the output, the quotas that they're not hitting. So by about a week into the strike, you have a third, if not more, of the workforce on strike.
Mm-hmm.
So we have all of these different, chronologies and geographies coming into play, mapped against these big meta narratives that are unfolding across the nation, with this schism between across the American labor movement, the AFL, the CIO, and
Right.
the structures that they put in play. So it's a matter of luck. Again, it's a matter of chronology in which Northwestern Steel, Northwestern Barbwire Company is at the forefront of these processes.
Okay.
So we're about a week, almost immediately, right? We have SWOC representatives coming down into Sterling, and they are organizing the workforce, right, to create a union that is vertical in structure, right? And the SWOC was the educational branch of the CIO, right? They were
Okay.
there to basically show them how to form a union.
How to how to strike, how to form the union.
Yep,
Yeah. Okay.
exactly. How to form a union, and then how to integrate this union into this new CIO based vertical industrial unionization, the campaign, the national campaign.
Okay.
So they show up. The SWOC representatives show up in Sterling, and they meet with the striking workforce. Again, like I said, immediately, like the next day, they're there giving speeches, and they say, um, you know, there are two things that we do not do when we strike. Right? We do not resort to violence, and we do
Mm-hmm.
not drink alcohol.
Hmm.
Okay, so those are the two main things. And anybody, yeah, I mean,
It's
it makes
it sounds
sense.
like they learned that from past experiences, you know.
I would almost imagine that is exactly, at the top of the list, right?
Right.
No violence and no alcohol. The
Well,
two
see,
seem to be
it seems to
interrelated.
me like this is like the Great Depression is a second wave, because you had the Gilded Age, before Teddy Roosevelt came along, and now FDR comes along and is handling the same stuff all over again. What's that?
Yep.
30, 40 years later.
No, you're absolutely right. The initial labor movement of the late 19th and early 20th century was galvanized through the square deal.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this is largely that craft union model,
Mm-hmm.
right? The skilled
The
workforce.
skilled labor. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you had the second wave of the unskilled labor.
Mm-hmm.
Again, there's a lot of baggage connected to those terms, and we won't
Mm-hmm.
even go into it,
Yeah,
both,
yeah. That's
in
a
terms of,
tangent. That's
yeah,
a whole nother podcast. Yeah.
race and gender, and
Right.
even migratory status, and there's a whole,
Mm-hmm.
it's a very loaded concept, but
Right.
we'll just keep it right on the surface for today.
Okay.
So the SWOC representatives come in to Sterling. They start organizing the striking workforce. They show them what to do. They tell them how to act. And more importantly, they start brokering deal with management.
Okay.
Right. So we're starting to think about, okay, now how we're on strike. What are our aims? What do we hope to achieve? right? And how do we achieve them?
Mm-hmm.
So immediately they set out their demands, and they undertake a campaign of industrial organization that includes bringing other workforce to their side, but also the community.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the main parts, that one of the main things that the SWOC representatives discuss is that you have to get public opinion on your side.
Got to talk to the mayor and all the people, and
Yeah, you have to have a groundswell of support,
mm-hmm.
a bottom up grassroots,
Right.
system of support, which
Mm-hmm.
is also speaking to the everyday people.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We
Yeah.
need a groundswell of support. We need, as we said before, we need strength in numbers,
Mm-hmm.
and we need, right, the implicit, right,
Mm-hmm.
support of the wider Sterling and Rock Falls community.
Yeah.
And
Well.
nothing will chase that support away like
Mm-hmm.
violence and
Mm-hmm.
drunkenness.
Yeah. And you have to explain to people too that you're going to go without a paycheck for a while, and some people can have enough of a stash to handle it, and some
Yeah.
people are desperate for the next paycheck, and those are the ones who will resist it, say, "No, I don't want to strike. We need the money."
Yes, exactly. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
financial needs must, and of course,
Mm-hmm.
that is one of the first things that the SWOC do as well, is they create a strike fund.
Mm.
So people that could donate money immediately for meals for the striking force, the striking workers,
Mm.
was immediately established. But of course, that's what the dues
Uh-huh.
pay for. It allows the collectivization of the movement to progress. So
So
by
is that a
having this,
national fund? Is that a
it,
national fund?
it can be, yes,
Okay. Okay.
it
Yeah.
can be.
All
Yeah, I
right.
mean, yeah, absolutely. You can dip into that fund on a
Mm.
national level. So if you
Mm-hmm.
create, like the AFL had a lot of money set aside, that's what your dues pay for in a union, right?
Right.
Is legal representation,
Mm-hmm.
right? But it also provides,
Mm-hmm.
that the financial hardships
Mm-hmm.
for your fellow worker who are on strike elsewhere, or
Mm-hmm.
for yourself.
Yeah. Okay.
It's a workers' insurance scheme as much as it is anything.
Yeah. And I'm
Yeah.
sure they're there to help talk the other 600 into striking now too.
Yes, absolutely. So they want to build on the momentum. They want to attract their fellow workers, out
Mm-hmm.
of sympathy and support,
Mm-hmm.
to come over and join them, with regards to the campaign of industrial action.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as you would guess, management does not take this lying down.
No, no, no.
They
Of
have
course
their
not.
own raft of techniques,
Mm-hmm.
to break strikes,
Mm-hmm.
which include hiring, right, workforce, temporary workforce from out of town.
What's
Right.
that? The old cliche
Yeah,
scab
exactly.
labor.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Strikers that
Yeah.
are labor force that
Mm-hmm.
undercut the
Mm-hmm.
campaign of industrial action.
Right.
And then they also leverage their social political status, for the purpose of gathering, right, the great and the good within the community to be sympathetic to their position as management.
Mm.
Now, what does that mean exactly in reality? Well, the chief of police, is the chief of police going to be on the side of the strikers who have to be told not to resort to violence and
Mm-hmm.
alcohol?
Right.
Or are they
Right.
going to be on the people who are in position of decision making and part of the establishment with
Right.
elite socioeconomic and social political positions? Of
Mm-hmm.
course, they're going to side with company management.
Mm-hmm.
The first thing that the Dillon family does, right? Paul Dillon, who is the owner of the mill, goes in and slaps an injunction, right? So
Mm-hmm.
he immediately goes to the circuit court judge and asks for an injunction that um, prevents the striking workforce from showing up at the picket lines right
Mm-hmm.
outside of there, out of fear that they will incite violence, out of
Mm-hmm.
fear that, of course, the workers who are not striking, who are not sympathetic to the campaign of industrial action, are not harassed and or even prevented from coming in. Because at the end of the day, management is worried about the output,
Sure.
right? And
But
they need to have
nothing's
workers to
changed,
do that.
has it?
No,
Nothing's changed. It's still, it was before that. It's still around today. And one of the significance of this paper is that you were saying that it was a first of
yes.
something. And if you would expand on that, what the first in the
Yeah.
country about?
So after 3 weeks of striking, of
Hmm.
which there was both violence and alcohol, after 3 weeks of a really hard fought strike that
Hmm.
was really on the edge there for a while. I mean, these outbursts of violence and these outbursts of chaotic street scenes in the city of Rock Falls and Sterling were
Hmm.
being reported at a national level. Some of the source material that I consulted for the purpose of this, because there
Hmm.
is very little record now at the actual mill,
Hmm.
you'll see, right? You'll see reporting on it in the New York Times,
Hmm.
the Washington Post. Of course,
How,
the Chicago Trib is not the
yeah.
Chicago Tribune is not unlikely, but you still see it being
Mhm.
reported in the
Sure.
Boston Daily Globe, for example.
How violent are we talking about? What are some of the most extreme things other than beer bottle throwing and
Yeah, so there's a lot. There is tear gas at one point.
hmm,
There are people hospitalized.
hmm,
There are open wounds.
hmm,
There are pistols found. There are shots fired,
hmm. That's what I was wondering.
and
Yeah.
there's a lot of like I said, general level of street chaos
Hmm.
that was on one side of the striking workforce, and then of course on the other side the authorities of law and order.
Sure.
There were roughly 2.5 dozen strikers that were jailed.
Hmm.
Two were immediately put in the Morrison County Prison and held there without bail
Hmm.
for the duration of the strike. Now, admittingly, it happened at the end of the strike,
Okay.
um, but there were a number of strikers that were jailed for inciting or partaking in violence,
Hmm.
and so it was pretty chaotic. And I think the last weekend before the agreement was reached between the SWOC and management, with the help, I should add, of the the National Labor Relations Board, which
Hmm.
was basically people from DC coming
Hmm.
in and
Stepped
saying,
in.
"Listen, yeah, like okay,
Hmm.
it's getting out of hand.
Right.
You know,
Right.
get to the table and figure this out." And that's after the weekend of violence. So basically, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday evening, right when we had the changeover, the shift from one shift to the next, right? You had the transition from the day shift to the night shift at 10 a.m.
Hmm.
and then again in the morning shift at 6 a.m.
Hmm.
On the Friday and Saturday and Sunday night. There
How,
was
how long did it
outbreaks of
last?
violence.
From
Three
July, you
weeks.
said June. How many?
3 weeks.
3 weeks. Okay.
So it was the 7th and 8th of July, and almost to the end of the July.
Okay.
So it was 3+ weeks. And so it got really close to the edge there
Hmm.
on that last weekend, and they had to call in additional authorities and additional police officers. They deputized about 100 police officers over
Hmm.
the course of the last weekend to help tie down all of the chaos.
Deputize, throw some ice masks on them, and say, "Hey, help us." That's another podcast. We can get
That
into
is another podcast. But yes, I
that.
mean, it's not uncommon, and as part of the injunction and as part of the support by the chief of police, of course, was
Hmm.
that they had the ability to deputize these emergency police officers,
Hmm.
and of course they had a anti-labor position, by
Hmm.
nature, by
Hmm.
by design almost. And there's no shortage of examples of an evidence
Mm-hmm.
ranging from Pinkertons down to the Chicago Police Department, who
Mm-hmm.
were really rough and tumble with some of these striking forces.
You mentioned the Kremlin a couple of times. What was that? What was the Russia connection all about?
So this is my favorite part. This is
All
my
right.
favorite part, Dave, and you're exactly right for bringing this up. So you have the very immediate focus on the for Industrial Organization and then the Steel Workers Organizing Committee, right? The CIO and the SWOC, right? You have
Okay.
very immediate, and then you have the striking workforce versus management, and as I discussed, you have the National Labor Relations Board, which is
Okay.
again a federal
Mm-hmm.
a federal apparatus that was dealing with strikes across the country. So
Mm-hmm.
you got those kind of very um, national, regional, and local
Mm-hmm.
themes, organizations, and institutions at play. And that is replicated across the country during this time,
Okay.
both in terms of early strikes, but
Mm-hmm.
also across the 1930s in this period that we're discussing right now. So that's
Okay.
nothing normal. That's nothing unusual. That's quite
Right.
normal. The added element that was injected into this particular episode, and as I should say, was born out of the wider conversations at a national and regional level, is that the CIO was staffed and at times run by communists,
Hmm.
members of the American Communist Party.
Hmm.
And the literature demonstrates quite, empirically that this was not the case. Of course, there were some communists
Mm-hmm.
that were part of the labor movement.
Right.
They were very good organizers, right? They were tireless builders, right? They were very, very good at forming unions.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but their position in terms of the bigger picture is
Mm-hmm.
overstated. Now, why?
Mm-hmm.
Who would have injected this aspect into the narrative? Who would have benefited basically from saying that communists were
Mm-hmm.
now running the CIO and
Well, it'd be
therefore the
like,
communists were running the SWOC?
well, it'd probably be like the owners saying that, saying, "Hey, you guys are bad with a Russian mafia infiltrating our country," and
Exactly. Exactly. The Bolshevism is a different type of Russian mafia, but it's but exactly right. So we have, but it filters down, David, in some of the source material that I consulted. You have
mm-hmm.
the Department of War discussing the implications of communism on everyday America, the
Right.
infiltration into all aspects of American life, and their
Mm-hmm.
complete disregard for constituted authority.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That is some Red Scare type stuff.
Sure.
We
Sure.
think about it in the 50s with McCarthy and everything, but it was in the interwar period too.
Yeah.
There's
I was to
nothing
say that this sounds kind of like the start of it, leading up
exactly.
into, clear
Yeah,
up to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And,
exactly. If you've seen Oppenheimer, right?
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's this period, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
In the interwar period in the 1930s, it's the same timeline, right?
Yeah.
So those people in position of constituted authority
Mm-hmm.
are, quite frankly, scared
Mm-hmm.
of any threat to their
Right.
position and privileges.
Right.
And the number one threat to their constituted authority and or position and privilege is, of course, communism.
Mm-hmm.
That
Yeah.
is the number one threat. And
Yeah.
that's not only in the United States, that's not only in the Midwest, that's not only in Sterling and Rockville, Illinois,
Right.
Rockfall, Illinois. It's across the globe, or the Western world, I should say, at this
Right.
point.
So what was it a first again? I still missed that part. It's like the first in the country of exactly what?
So we have this, this aspect of communism being brought into it,
Mm-hmm.
as a discrediting force, of which the management at Northwestern Barbed Wire Company, and the Dillon
Mm-hmm.
family inject into the conversation, and it's a talking point throughout the 3 weeks. But that largely is set to the side,
Mm.
for a number of reasons that we can kind of circle back to. But when the smoke cleared and the dust settled, right, a top grown up from the National Labor Relations Board shows up in Sterling and Rock Falls and says, "Okay, this is done. Everybody get into this room, and we're not leaving until we've got a deal." And they reach a deal.
Can't you all get along?
Exactly. I mean, so they bring both sides together. They broker a deal, and effectively, the result is that management acknowledges the establishment of Union Local 36.
Okay. Mm.
And Local 36 is the first union within the national campaign
Mm-hmm.
to organize the steel industry through the SWOC and the
Mm.
CIO.
Okay. That's what I
So
was looking for.
it was the first chartered union. It was
Mm-hmm.
the first union granted by the SWOC and the CIO. So
Now,
you can
take
imagine
that's a
sorry,
big deal. No,
it's
no,
a
no.
big
Go ahead.
deal. Yeah,
Yeah.
they say, victory has a
Mm-hmm.
1,000 fathers and
Mm-hmm.
defeat is an orphan. Well, we're talking
Mm-hmm.
about victory here, so
Mm-hmm.
everybody claims victory for this. So the
Sure.
SWOC claimed victory. The
Sure.
CIO claimed victory. And of
Right.
course, Local 36 claims
Mm-hmm.
victory.
Right.
And the immediate workforce in Sterling and Rock Falls at Northwestern.
Mm-hmm.
So that those victories that are claimed for different
Mm-hmm.
reasons, but
Mm-hmm.
basically from the same position, is
Right.
amplified and modeled out across the country as, look,
Right.
they did it here in
Right.
Sterling, in the small
Mm-hmm.
communities of Sterling and Rock Falls, Illinois. We're going to
Mm-hmm.
model this up and model it out
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
an example of
Mm-hmm.
how to organize the steel industry
Mm-hmm.
in these vertical union
Good.
structures.
And that's a big spark. That's a big spark for the
Massive,
all over the country.
massive.
Hey, yeah, and what I want you to talk about, since we talked about the first, is I'm fascinated with the Gilded Age after the Civil War and everything, and the Pinkertons and the Pittsburgh, and all the way back to before Teddy Roosevelt came along. Did they, when you say the first, did they not get to unionize back before Teddy Roosevelt? Help me on my history here.
Yeah, no, no, no. So sorry, Dave. I
Yep.
should have been clear. The union that they established at Northwestern
Okay.
Barbed Wire Company was
Mm-hmm.
the first union in these vertical industrial unions
Mm-hmm.
for against the national campaign to organize the steel industry. There
Okay.
were
Okay.
unions everywhere, right?
Okay.
There were unions
Okay.
everywhere since the 1880s.
Mm-hmm.
But this union, right,
Mm-hmm.
Local 36,
Mm-hmm.
is the first union
Mm-hmm.
within this national campaign to organize the steel industry
Okay.
into these vertical union
Okay.
structures.
That's the clarification I was looking
Yeah,
for. Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
So now,
absolutely. There's unions all both before and after that, but
right.
this is a isolated, discrete incident of
Mm-hmm.
which is mapped against
Mm-hmm.
these national kind of
Mm-hmm.
campaigns within this kind of labor
Mm-hmm.
schism,
Which is what makes it nationally important, not just the
which
fact
is,
that it's something that means something to you and I.
yeah,
Being so
exactly.
local to it.
It's
Yeah.
more than just Uncle Phil talking about
Mm-hmm.
his union.
Mm-hmm.
It is
Mm-hmm.
it is of a historical and
Mm-hmm.
national significance.
Okay. And did it last? I mean, how long did, everything good for how long until, I think the company, you said the company's not even in existence anymore. It turned into something
No.
else.
Yeah. So the Wagner Act did not last very long,
Okay.
and the Wagner Act was reversed in Congress in the immediate post-war era. So
Mm,
that kind of put the labor movement on a downward spiral, or at
mhm,
least leveled off the trajectory within the interwar years.
mhm,
So the union exists all the way up until the end of Northwestern, right?
mhm,
Steel and Wire Company, as it became in the post-war era.
mhm,
And um, after the leveling off of the legislation and the at the federal level, the support,
mhm,
um, unions have started to fizzle out from the 1980s.
mhm,
And we know that union membership is down significantly from a post Reagan era.
mm, mhm,
Now, Northwestern Steel and Wire Company hit its peak largely, again, like most manufacturing industries in the United States, in the
mhm.
late 70s and the early 80s.
Sure,
But
sure.
by the 21st century,
Mhm,
most of the steel industries had been, broken down and sold off,
mhm.
mainly to foreign investors,
Right.
and or closed altogether. And that's basically
Mhm.
the same trajectory mapped against Northwestern Steel and Wire Company.
Unions just keep struggling, decade after decade, especially after the 80s when Reagan injected, capitalism with steroids,
Mm.
and just you gave the owners so much, ability to, oppress the unions that we're still battling that today. I mean,
Yeah,
the poor workers are still getting taken advantage of. And I think a lot of that has to do with globalization too. Whenever the workers strike too hard or ask for too much, they're like, all right, we're going to close down and go to somewhere else with cheaper labor.
yeah. I mean, there's a lot of those. There's a lot of those elements in play for sure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And globalization. We could talk about a whole
Mm-hmm.
podcast if you want to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Absolutely. But I think the decline in labor union membership
Mm-hmm.
since the 1980s is a combination of not only socio-political and socioeconomic rhetoric that came
Mm-hmm.
from the White House and
Right.
cascaded all the way down, with the injection or the onset of the ridiculous term entrepreneur,
Mm-hmm.
which is the antithesis to the labor unionized worker.
Sure.
But we also see a shift in legislation. I mean, I already talked about how the Wagner Act fell apart in a
Mm-hmm.
post-war era, but by the
Mm-hmm.
1980s, the last bit of the labor legislation was being dismantled,
Yeah.
piece by
Yeah.
piece.
Yeah.
Reagan, considerably weakened the efficacies and right
Mm-hmm.
the structures of collective bargaining.
Yeah.
Right, you can no longer guarantee your job. It was
Mm-hmm.
obviously an anti-labor administration in
Right.
the traditional sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
In a number of these pieces of legislation that came in across the 1980s and, let's be honest, into the 1990s, Clinton,
Mm-hmm.
was not the most friendly in terms
Mm-hmm.
of pro-labor legislation,
Mm-hmm.
but he had to pick and choose his own
Yeah.
battles, I suppose. But it
Well, I
is
think.
that 1-2 punch, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
The
Mm-hmm.
mindset and the
Mm-hmm.
socio-political rhetoric and the socio-economic
Yeah.
rhetoric of capital friendly
Yeah.
language and the onset of this ridiculous term of the
Right.
entrepreneur, and then of course the second uppercut, which
Right.
considerably weakened it from a legislative position.
Well, let me ask you your opinion on this, because to me it seems like when everything's going great, and like after World War II, everything was great. We had the world economy to ourselves, and in the 80s and 90s, we had the tech boom, and everything was great, and people were making money. it seems to weaken unions' power, doesn't it? When everything's great, quit your bitching, versus when times are tough, then unions get stronger. What's your take on that?
It's a good point, and it's a tough question to
Mm-hmm.
answer. I think there's a lot that could be said about that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, First and foremost, right? We are no longer a manufacturing economy. We're a service economy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And let's face it, unionization of the labor force
Mm-hmm.
grew up around manufacturing
Mm-hmm.
and output of different type of production,
Sure.
right?
Sure.
And we are now a service industry.
Right.
Now, that's not to say that these structures can't be modeled up and modeled over.
Yeah. Yeah.
Indeed, if you think
Yeah.
about education as a service,
Mm-hmm.
in universities,
Mm-hmm.
Harvard is, the higher education in the United States is one of its best industries because
Yeah.
it's a service industry. It's
Yeah.
exporting and importing knowledge from across the world, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
But all those profs are
Mm-hmm.
unionized. All
Yeah.
the teachers are unionized.
Yeah.
So there's still models that can be applied.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can still do it. One of the best examples of that I've learned is in Vegas. The culinary union
Yeah.
is excellent. I
Yep.
mean, just
Yep.
being in the service industry out in Vegas,
Yep.
and a lot of that has to do with there's so many of them. That strength in numbers. Is a
Yep.
good example why the culinary union's so strong.
Yep. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. I'm not saying that it can't be applied,
Right.
but it just doesn't have that history that the
Right.
manufacturing or the heavy industries do.
Mm-hmm.
And mainly because of some of the themes that we talked about today is that we're now back to a kind of a craft model system.
Mm-hmm.
These service industries are not, they cut across or they're highly skilled artisan type of employees
Mm-hmm.
and labor forces. It's
Right.
not this kind of factory unskilled kind of labor that we're dealing
Right.
with, quote unquote.
Right.
So I think that has something to do with the decline. I
Mm-hmm.
think the legislation that hollowed out
Mm-hmm.
and completely neutered any hope of
Mm-hmm.
keeping the strong union legacy going is a
Mm-hmm.
problem.
I'd say Citizens United had a lot to do with that too. Given so much big money and the owners so much more political power to buy off politicians.
Yeah,
That's a huge part of it.
and that's it. That's it, Dave.
Mm-hmm.
That's really what it comes down to
Mm-hmm.
is that in addition to the loss of manufacturing and everything, but in reality,
Mm-hmm.
we see across the 80s, 90s, and into the 21st century is a pro capital position.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have a pro labor position anymore. We have a
Right.
pro capital position. I think COVID has done a little bit to readdress that balance.
Mm-hmm.
You see Amazon and Starbucks and these people starting to unionize.
Mm-hmm.
Walmart.
Mm-hmm.
That these kind of 21st century businesses, organizations, institutions starting to
Right.
unionize. So I think that there's a little bit of a groundswell or a little bit of
Mm-hmm.
momentum. I liked the fact that Joe Biden had the protection for the right to organize as part of one of his big bills. It never passed, of course, but I'd
Mm-hmm.
like to see it back on the agenda.
At least he was trying. Yeah.
And so that's important.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that those are a range of factors, but
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the day, from the 80s onward, we have a
Mm-hmm.
pro capital government, we have pro capital legislation, and we have
Mm-hmm.
a pro capital mindset.
Yeah. Well, we got about 10 minutes left, so let's finish on that. One of the things that I'm pretty passionate about is the middle class. The balance between rich and poor, the balance between Democrats and Republicans, and so I am always trying to do is look at both points of view and say, all
Mm,
right, you got good points, you got good points, let's
mm.
compromise. And I think
Yeah,
there's not enough of that in the world.
there's
So,
not.
with the last 10 minutes, one thing that I want to bring up is why the American workers are so mad again. I
Mm,
mean, there's you got a couple of different reasons. One, you got the billionaires hogging all the money again. So
yeah,
here we are in a second gilded age. A lot of people are calling it.
yeah.
And I think that's why so many of the American workers, are so mad at, the immigrants coming in. They think they're coming in and taking jobs, and
Mm.
looking down, saying, hey, stop taking our jobs, or stop being lazy with welfare recipients,
Mm.
instead of looking at the true, which that's still part of the problem, but a much smaller percentage than the
Very small,
billionaires taking all the
very
money.
small, very small.
Yeah. And I understand their point. I want to stick up for them a little bit, because I understand their anger. It is
Mm.
irritating when you are working hard and everybody else is just screwing around.
Mm.
I mean, just think about, when mom and dad used to make us clean the house, and a
Mm.
couple of us are cleaning and everybody else is messing around. It
Mm.
makes you mad,
Yeah,
you know? And
yeah.
so I do understand that, hey, I'm working and you're taking my tax money and you're
Mm.
sitting at home, eating Cheetos, watching,
Mm.
soap operas.
Mm.
But they're realizing that that's just a small percentage of it. The bigger
Sliver,
percentage of it is,
sliver.
the billionaires controlling our lawmakers and our Congress and Washington, and hogging all the money again.
Billions in tax breaks to the richest 500 families. I mean,
Yeah. Stop it.
that
So,
that would pay for all of the benefit cheats, all of the welfare mamas, which is
mm-hmm,
a really racially charged statement
sure,
that
sure.
and a derogatory term that Reagan put into the American lexicon. I mean,
Mm-hmm,
that's a really really bad way to
right.
describe people. But that image sticks.
Oh,
You know,
yeah.
and people still use that term today to describe
Mm-hmm,
welfare cheats and benefit cheats, and
mm-hmm,
it's absurd. It's
yeah.
absurd. Just look at the statistics. Look at
Mm-hmm,
the percentage of the budget
mm-hmm,
that goes towards welfare recipients is
mm-hmm,
minute,
mm-hmm,
and then the percentage within that minute percentage is
mm-hmm,
overwhelmingly for children and old people.
sure. Yeah.
The 25 to 55-year-old welfare lazy recipient doesn't exist. It's a unicorn.
Right.
It's a social phantom
There are
created
not many of them.
entirely by the
Yeah.
political elite.
Yeah. Well, those are those political footballs, and like I say, they play dirty. I
Yeah.
mean, watching some of these news channels is all they do is, just
Yeah.
I don't like to use the word lie, but just blatantly, use propaganda to get
Yeah.
people all riled up and pissed off, and
Yeah.
and so I
It's not
think the
helpful.
the
It's not helpful.
no, it's not. The polarization in our country right now is just horrible.
Yeah. It's due
And
to
one of
the
that is
talking
all,
heads. Yeah.
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 The main reason is the guy at the top, how I feel about that. But it's also the issues too. There's a lot of things that, people have good points on. So,
And just circling back, Dave,
mhm,
it is ridiculous, and I
mhm,
mean ridiculous,
mhm,
that the Republican Party is now the voice of the everyday unionized,
mhm.
American. It is
Right,
ridiculous,
right,
but it is politically astute.
right, right.
It is politically astute because the only people to blame are
Mhm.
the Democrats.
Sure.
Are the
They've dropped the
Democrats.
ball. They've
They
dropped the
can
ball
blame.
on it.
They can blame Democrats.
Yeah.
If we look at this in historical terms,
Mhm.
right? We've talked a little bit about this before. If we look at this in historical terms, the bread and butter, the base of the Democratic Party was the dirt road Democrat.
Mhm.
Was the dirt road Democrat that voted for a pro labor position, right? And therefore, Democrats were kings.
Mhm.
And that dirt road Democrat now votes Republican
Yeah. Yeah.
because that dirt road Democrat is you know fiscally liberal but
Mhm.
socially conservative,
Mhm. Yeah.
and of course the Democrats are
Mhm.
you know socially liberal or
Mhm.
fiscally conservative but socially liberal.
Mhm. Yeah,
And
well, they
that's an inversion that
Mhm.
just has emerged as a result. The
Mhm.
Democrats are more important, are more concerned about the social liberalism rather
Mhm.
than the fiscal liberalism.
Yeah.
You know,
That's
they're
what
they're they're plugged into globalized structures. They don't give a
Yeah.
monkeys about it.
No. That's what I've been saying for years now, that, the Democratic Party is just as bought and paid for, by the rich donor class as the Republican Party. And, I always see that picture of the rich person with on the marionette strings, controlling both
Yeah, yeah,
parties.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I really think the leadership of the Democratic Party for way too long now has just acted like they're
Yeah,
trying. They're
yeah.
not putting their back into it at all.
No.
I mean, we have some very weak, pathetic leadership. And I think that's the reason why we lost so many voters, in the
Yeah,
election.
yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
for one, if you're going to, backstab Bernie Sanders as bad as you did, who was, one of the, best politicians I've seen in my lifetime,
Mm,
and then, and just ignore the working class, I can see
yeah,
why a lot of people abandon the
yeah,
Democratic Party,
yeah.
you
I
know.
mean, they
There's,
only have themselves to blame
that's
for
right.
the inversion of
Mm-hmm.
American politics
Right.
based on class. They
Right.
only have their self to blame.
Mm-hmm.
And the
Right.
inversion of class politics in
Mm-hmm.
the American system includes
Mm-hmm.
unionized labor.
Yeah. Yeah. Getting people to work together, and so that leads into, let's finish with this, is that leads into one of my videos that I keep making about racism, is because racism ties into people working together, and
Yeah,
the American people have got to work together,
yeah.
and that's a big part of it. And people don't want to work together unless they like each other. So one of the biggest solutions is to get people to like each other again.
And
And
and,
so that's
and
kind of one of
yeah.
my focuses right now.
And it's a great focus. It's a great point.
Mhm.
And again,
Mhm.
looking through the not so distant historical lens
Mhm.
to try to make a long legacy of racial segregation work socially is
Mhm.
awkward.
Mhm.
But to make racial integration work economically is very easy.
Right.
And that's what the unions started to do. You
Sure.
see these rainbow coalitions where you have unions, black, white,
Mhm.
Latino, it doesn't matter.
Mhm.
It doesn't
Mhm.
matter because they had this shared economic interests.
Mhm.
But the Democrats of the last 30 years are hell bent in making the integration about social interests.
Right.
And
Right.
it's a fool's errand.
Yep.
It's a fool's errand. You
Yep.
have to integrate people through their economic interests.
Yeah.
And the
And
only
the
way to
way I
do
say
that
it,
is through the unionization of labor.
yeah, the way that I say it is the social issues are important, yes, but the money is what really matters. You know, the money
It's
is
class, it's not race. It's
right.
class.
Thank you. Thank you. That's another good way to put it. So,
It's class.
all
It's a
right.
class driven hierarchy. It's not a racially driven hierarchy. Now,
Mhm.
unfortunately, race has worked its way into class because of our horrific, legacy of race
Oh,
in the
sure.
United States.
Oh, yeah.
But if we want
Yeah.
to undo that horrific legacy,
Mhm.
the vehicle is economic interests.
That's right. That's right. You start making people's lives more comfortable, they'll start liking each other better.
Exactly. You don't disagree with your neighbor who's on the same class level as you.
That's
You know,
right.
you don't fight with your neighbor. And I'm afraid that that's no longer part of the conversation.
Right.
And I wonder
Right.
why.
Yeah. Our media and our political propaganda dividing us, and anyway, that could be a, topic for our next one,
Yeah,
so,
yeah, absolutely.
well, yeah, anything before we wrap up, anything you want to add about your paper? You're going to be
No,
getting
no,
that published soon, or
that's right. It's in review right now with the
okay.
Journal of the Illinois State Historical Society. So if you're listening, please send it back with minor corrections and acceptance. That would be great. Um, but yeah, no, it's I think the closing argument really is that we see an episode in history, in American history,
Mhm.
that A captures my imagination because I have a real visceral understanding of the place and the space,
Mhm.
and that's not very often that you get a chance to dedicate 6 months researching and output a 8,000 word article that something of national significance that has such a localized meaning to you. That was great.
Right.
It was
Right.
fun. It was a fantastic. But I think really is what they have to understand. The takeaway message of the actual paper is that these everyday Americans came together and leveraged their labor for
Mm-hmm.
a bigger piece of the pie and
Mm-hmm.
better working conditions through
Mm-hmm.
aligned economic interests.
Right.
Not because communists told them to, or not
Mm-hmm.
because they were threatened by management. They did
Right.
it because they thought that they were part of a national community and it was in their
Mm-hmm.
best interest to do so.
Mm-hmm.
So these kind of meta narratives that feed into it, John Lewis told you to do this, or Joseph Stalin told you to do this, or Paul Dillon
Mm-hmm.
told you to do this, is ridiculous. It's not
Right.
true, right? They undertook a course of industrial action not because people told them to do that, because they believed it to be true themselves.
Right. And they work together to make it happen, which is what my Balance the World stuff is all about.
Yep.
Working together to establish a balance with our planet. And not just here in America, but I'm talking globally. We need to start thinking globally more. We have a planet to take care of, not a country,
Yeah.
not just a country anyway, or a city or a state or a neighborhood. We
Agreed.
have we need to look at it globally. So that's what I'm going to keep pushing for and for the rest of my life anyway. So anyway, thank you very much, buddy. I enjoyed hearing about your paper, and until next time, we'll do it again with another topic.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Always a pleasure.
All right, man. You take care. Have a good day, buddy.
Thanks, pal.